Syd Barrett is supposed to be the easiest kind of rock myth to understand. The mad genius who burned too bright on LSD and vanished, leaving a handful of brilliant songs and a cautionary tale. It's a story that flatters everyone else. The band who went on without him, the scene that egged him on, the listeners who still put on Shine On You Crazy Diamond and feel sorry for a stranger. But look closely at the trajectory. The careful Cambridge childhood, the sudden elevation to spokesman for a drugged-out generation, the months when his breakdown was treated as a stage effect, the solo sessions where producers had to sing his own songs into his ear to keep him on track, the decades of quiet domestic routines under a legend he didn't consent to. At some point, this stops being a myth about one unstable man and starts looking like a user manual for how a whole era consumes and discards minds that don't fit. Long before anyone called him Sid, he was simply Roger Keith Barrett, a bright, restless boy in a tidy Cambridge house where the garden was small, the piano slightly out of tune, and the shelves were heavy with books. His father was a pathologist, calm and curious, the kind of man who could turn a dinner table into a classroom without ever raising his voice. His mother kept the house open to neighbors and friends, the kettle always ready to boil again. The Barrett children were the sort of offspring local teachers liked to point to. Well-read, articulate, seemingly cut out for respectable futures. On paper, it looked like the kind of childhood that protects a person from the world's harsher edges. Inside that house, Roger was already angling away from the path laid out for him. He would sit on the floor with a pencil and lose hours in drawings that made no obvious sense to adults. Elongated people, animals whose bodies were made of zigzags, houses whose windows looked back at you. He loved words in a way that had less to do with meaning than with texture. Nonsense rhymes, half-rhymes, sentences that bent in the middle, all of it delighted him. He mimicked his teachers so accurately that classmates could not tell for a few seconds whether the real person had walked into the room. He had the early signs of someone who could rearrange reality for others simply by telling the story differently. Then his father died, and the story rearranged itself around him instead. The explanations were clinical, graciously delivered. A boy does not grieve in footnotes. Something solid went missing from Roger's world and was replaced by a slightly hollow echo, a sense that stability was a rumor adults repeated to each other but could not enforce. In the years that followed, he became both more and less himself, more dazzling in public, faster with jokes, more inventive with his drawings, more withdrawn in private, more inclined to disappear into his own head where nobody could reach him. Friends later would remember a charming, magnetic teenager who could hold a room without seeming to try. They did not always see how hard it was for him to climb back down from that performance when the night was over. Music gave him a structure nothing else did. Skiffle, American rhythm and blues, early rock and roll. These reached Cambridge through crackling radios and imported records. Roger listened, absorbed, and then began to take the songs apart the way his father had once taken organs apart in the lab. A guitar arrived in the house. He learned chords quickly and then just as quickly learned how to ignore them. He scraped the strings with coins, tuned them to odd intervals, let feedback bloom, and then strangled it back into something almost conventional. To those watching, it looked like youthful experimentation. To him, it felt like discovering a language that could keep up with the way his thoughts moved. Art school in London was the next logical step and the next fracture. Cambridge had been a cloister. London in the mid-60s was a laboratory with no safety rules pinned to the wall. The same sensibility that had led him toward odd colors and dissonant chords drew him toward the new drug culture orbiting art colleges and basement clubs. LSD arrived not as a demon but as a promise, hand-delivered on sugar cubes and blotter paper by people who spoke with missionary zeal about opening the doors of perception. For a young man already obsessed with breaking frames and seeing around corners, the idea was irresistible. At first, it seemed to work exactly as advertised. The band that was coalescing around him, at various points called the T-Set, the Pink Floyd sound, and finally just Pink Floyd, found that under the influence of acid, their songs stretched and mutated in ways that thrilled the audiences at the UFO Club and other underground venues. Projectors hurled oil slide galaxies against the walls, and the group produced a soundtrack that felt less like accompaniment and more like atmosphere. Syd, by then firmly separated from Roger in most people's minds, stood at the center of it. Young, beautiful, eyes wide, guitar slung low, singing about scarecrows and gnomes and interstellar overdrives as if nursery rhymes and rocket launches belonged naturally in the same breath. Those early shows were improvised seances. Some nights he led with a sure hand, steering the band through crescendos and quiet drops with tiny movements of his shoulders or the angle of his head. Other nights he floated away mid-song, his expression shifting from intensity to vacancy as though some internal dial had been spun too far. The others would watch him from the corners of their eyes, hearts racing for reasons that had little to do with the drugs or the audience, and vamp on the same chords, hoping something would click back into place behind his stare. Sometimes it did. Each time it did not, they had to decide whether what was happening in front of them was art or the visible edge of a breakdown. In the studio, the contradictions sharpened. The album that emerged from those sessions, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, caught a particular moment in rock history, and in Syd's mind, with unnerving clarity. Songs like Astronomy Damen and Lucifer Sam had hooks catchy enough to satisfy a record company that wanted singles, but their structures were twisted just enough to unsettle. Bike ended not with a neat chorus, but with a collage of laughter, clockwork noises, and tape loops that felt like being locked inside a child's toy box overnight. The lyrics danced between whimsical and ominous so quickly that it was hard to tell where innocence ended and menace began. To listeners, that ambiguity was exciting. To those around him, it began to look like a map of places he might not be able to find his way back from. LSD did not create his irregularities. It wrapped them in neon and sped them up. Trip followed trip. Days blurred into nights in flats thick with smoke and people. The more Syd leaned into the experience, the more others leaned on him as proof that their scene was as radical as they believed. If he stared past you and laughed at nothing, that was not a symptom. It was someone being far out. If he arrived late, unwashed, with pupils like coins and an odd story about having walked for hours without knowing where he was going, that was not a crisis. It was the price of pushing boundaries. Every culture invents its own way of ignoring the obvious. The hip London of 1967 specialized in treating distress as performance. The stories from that period have been told and retold so often they have taken on the sheen of fables. The night Syd allegedly dosed the band by slipping LSD into a shared drink before a show. The television appearance where he simply refused to mime, letting his mouth hang slack while the others faked along to the track. The concert where he jammed one chord through an entire set, leaving the rest of the group to improvise an escape route. The gig where he smeared his hair and face with Brill cream and crushed tablets until the heat of the lights began to melt the mixture, dribbling down his cheeks so that he seemed to be dissolving on stage. Each anecdote gets told with a slightly different spin depending on who is speaking and what point they are trying to make. Taken together, they show a young man losing contact with the agreed-upon rules of behavior while everyone around him tried to decide whether to clap or intervene. For a while, the band tried to work around him. The solution on paper was elegant. Bring in another guitarist and singer, David Gilmour, an old Cambridge friend who knew Syd's habits and could play the songs convincingly. On stage, Pink Floyd became a five-piece, with Gilmour covering when Syd drifted and amplifying him when he surged. The hope was that the balance would steady him, give him space to recalibrate. The reality for the people who had to share vans and hotel rooms and rehearsal spaces with him was messier. Syd would sometimes not show up at all. At other times, he would arrive so altered that no one could tell if he was following what was happening in the room. There were nights when he seemed agonized by the simple fact of being looked at. The decision to stop picking him up, the famous "let's not bother" car ride, did not come from cruelty so much as from accumulated fear and exhaustion. There is something almost unbearably banal about that moment. No ritual, no confrontation, no dramatic explosion. Just a car full of young men who had reached the end of what they could improvise and a tacit agreement that the experiment of trying to keep Syd in the band had run out of road. In their own memories, they describe it with guilt and justification braided together. They loved him. They were scared of him. They did not know what else to do. They wanted to keep the thing they had built from collapsing entirely. All of these can be true and still insufficient. Pink Floyd without Syd became enormous. Progressive rock concept albums, stadium shows, inflatable pigs, stage designs that cost more than their entire early equipment. The music they made in the wake of his departure returned to images of madness and dislocation again and again, as if trying to write their way back through a door that had already closed. Roger Waters sang about lunatics on the grass and voices in one's head. David Gilmour bent notes into long arcs of grief that felt to millions of listeners like the sound of unspecific but overwhelming loss. On Dark Side of the Moon, the mechanics of time, money, fear, and isolation are laid out over a heartbeat. On Wish You Were Here, the absence of one man becomes a universal metaphor for missing anybody. All of it is, in some way, a conversation with the image of Syd Barrett that each band member carried, while they toured the world and watched their album covers become posters on dorm walls. Syd was in small London flats trying to make records of his own. The sessions for the Madcap Laughs and the follow-up album are the point where the romantic myth of the crazy genius begins to feel least comfortable next to the documented reality. Producers and musicians who were there describe a man who could sometimes snap into lucidity long enough to deliver a whole song in one take, and then, the next day, forget the chords to something he had written. They remember having to sing his own lines into his ear between takes so that he could find his way back into them. At times, the roles inverted completely. The supposedly mad artist trying to keep up with the structure of his old work while the sober professionals fed it to him in fragments like nurses guiding a patient through physical therapy. Listening to those albums now, it is hard not to hear the labor behind them. Beautiful moments surface, a turn of phrase that is both funny and heartbreaking, a chord change that feels like a corner of the room lifting. Then the song stumbles, drops a beat, repeats, veers off. The decision to leave those imperfections in, to present the tracks as brittle and uneven as they are, is often praised as an act of honesty. It is also inevitably part of the way the industry packaged Syd's decline as another product. You can hear in the creaks and missteps both a human being struggling with a mind that will not obey, and a set of record company calculations about how much fragility an audience will find fascinating rather than simply tragic. After those sessions, Syd did something that rock myths rarely give their subjects permission to do. He left. Not in a blaze of overdose or a spectacular on-stage breakdown, but in a slow, almost invisible retreat. He went back to Cambridge, moved in with his mother, and more or less stopped participating in public life. Neighbors got used to seeing him walking, cycling, doing errands. Sometimes he would stop and chat. Sometimes he kept his eyes on the pavement as if focusing on the next step were work enough. He painted obsessively, then destroyed canvases, then painted again. He let his hair grow, then shaved it all off. He answered to Roger rather than Syd. When journalists or overly determined fans tracked him down and tried to ask about the old days, He would shut down the conversation with a few flat words or simply walk away. This is the part of the story that does not fit into the usual live fast, die young, leave a good-looking corpse script, because it involves no spectacle. Living quietly with long-term mental health problems and an unwanted fame is neither glamorous nor narratively tidy. It does not translate well into posters or montages. Yet it is the longest chapter of his life. For roughly 3 decades, longer than he spent in Pink Floyd, longer than his entire time as a public figure, Roger Barrett was a man in a small house, negotiating each day with the shape of his thoughts, growing vegetables, buying groceries, visiting his sister, sometimes emerging, sometimes not. Around him, the legend thickened like fog. Books were written, documentaries made, songs dedicated. The image of Syd Barrett grew sharper as the actual person blurred into ordinariness. In 1975, in the middle of this retreat, came the Abbey Road visitation. Pink Floyd, now deep into the making of Wish You Were Here, had built an entire suite of music around the theme of absence, with one long, mournful piece explicitly dedicated to Syd. Shine on You Crazy Diamond is both tribute and confession, a mixture of admiration and apology. While they were working on it, the heavy-set, bald man with the plastic bag appeared in the control room. It took them minutes to recognize him. When they realized, some of them cried. They played him the song that was, in effect, his eulogy, written while he was still alive. He listened, apparently without much visible reaction, made a few odd remarks, and left before anyone could turn the moment into the cathartic scene they might have wanted. It is hard to overstate how strange that moment is, ethically as well as emotionally. A group of men have made a piece of art out of their feelings about someone they abandoned. As they are refining it, the abandoned man walks in, transformed almost beyond recognition by time and illness. They are shocked not only by his appearance but by the collision between the version of him they have been singing about, frozen in time as the young, shining genius, and the reality of the man standing in front of them. For a culture that prefers clean arcs, it is an uncomfortable intrusion of the living into a narrative that had already mentally filed him under tragic past. The user manual for discarding minds does not usually include a chapter on what to do. If the discarded mind quietly returns and stands in the corner while you talk about it in the third person. Syd's death in 2006 from complications related to diabetes came and went without the pyrotechnics rock journalism often expects. Obituaries rehearsed the familiar beats: psychedelic pioneer, acid casualty, recluse. Photos from the 1960s played on news sites next to less flattering, more recent paparazzi shots. Pink Floyd and its members issued statements, some more heartfelt than others. For a few weeks, there was a flurry of reissues and think pieces. Then the world's attention rolled on to the next anniversary, the next box set, the next story about someone else's implosion. In Cambridge, a small family dealt with the entirely ordinary logistics of a loved one's death. There were no cameras in the kitchen when the kettle boiled and the first cup of tea was poured after the funeral. Looking back across the whole arc, from careful Cambridge childhood to London clubs to Abbey Road apparition to quiet end, it becomes harder and harder to accept the shorthand version of Syd Barrett as merely mad genius who blew his mind on LSD. That version erases the structural context and serves the needs of everyone except the person at its center. It lets the band off easy. They tried, he would not be helped, they had to move on. It lets the scene off. They were all experimenting. He was the unlucky one. It could have been anyone. It lets listeners off. They can keep enjoying the music and feeling wistful about the crazy diamond without having to think too hard about what it says about their own appetites. The longer, less flattering version is not about villainy so much as about neglect. It shows a bright, sensitive boy whose mind did not fit easily into the social norms around him. thrown into a cultural moment that celebrated breaking norms without developing corresponding forms of care. It shows a group of young men improvising their way through a crisis with no models and no support, making decisions that were understandable and devastating at the same time. It shows an industry that was quicker to record a breakdown than to stop it, and an audience that found the aesthetics of disintegration compelling enough to keep buying tickets. It shows, above all, how easy it is to rebrand someone's suffering as part of their mystique, once they are no longer around to contradict you. None of this cancels out the genuine affection and grief people felt for Syd, then and now. It is possible to love someone and still fail them. It is also possible to be moved deeply by art that comes from places you would never wish on anyone. The question his life leaves behind is not whether we should feel guilty for liking the songs. Guilt is a shallow and self-centered emotion if it does not lead anywhere. But what we do with the insight they offer into how we handle the people who make them. One way to answer that question would be to change the script for the next Syd who appears. The next young person whose head seems very irregular, who takes more from acid or anxiety or grief than their peers do, who begins to blur the line between performance and distress, instead of leaning back and saying, "How fascinating." Perhaps the grown-ups in the room, managers, bandmates, audiences, families, could lean forward and say, "We need to stop, slow down, find help." Even if that means fewer shows, fewer records, less content, it is much less dramatic than watching someone disintegrate in public. It is also much kinder. Another way is to adjust how we tell these stories. When we talk about Syd Barrett now, we can resist the temptation to dwell only on the kaleidoscopic early brilliance or the picturesque later isolation. We can remember the middle years in detail, the sessions where he needed someone to sing his own songs to him line by line, the days when his friends were too scared to be in the same car with him and too scared not to be, the ordinary routines of a man in late middle age buying paintbrushes and bread. Those images sit less comfortably on a poster, but they do a better job of honoring the full human cost behind the legend. None of this will change the past. The careful Cambridge boy became the reluctant emblem of a scene that did not know how to protect him. The band that could not save him made some of the most enduring records of their era out of their feelings about failing to save him. The listeners who were not there, who came along years or decades later, found solace and recognition in those records without ever having to smell the rehearsal rooms or watch the decline up close. Those facts are set. What remains open is how we carry them. Syd Barrett is still in many ways the perfect rock myth. Short, intense, tragic, tidy. But the more closely his trajectory is traced, the more that myth begins to look less like a one-off and more like a template. Take one imaginative, fragile brain. Add cultural hunger for newness and transgression. Stir in cheap, unregulated chemicals and an almost total absence of mental health understanding. Apply attention and adulation at a speed no human nervous system is built for. When the subject starts to crack, interpret it as a more radical form of art for as long as the results are marketable. When the cracks widen into gaps, quietly move the subject out of frame and continue to use their outline as inspiration. Years later, organize tributes, reissues, and documentaries that frame the outcome as inevitable and the whole process as poignant rather than brutal. Seen that way, the question is no longer, what happened to Syd Barrett? The question is, why does this manual keep getting reused, and why do so few people read the warning labels? As long as we keep treating stories like his as sad but somehow necessary fuel for the culture we love, the system that devoured him will remain in good working order, ready for the next irregular head that appears under its lights. If you rewind the tape and let it run more slowly, other details surface. Things that never quite fit the convenient outline of acid casualty. Before the clubs and the oil slides, there was the small Cambridge school where teachers passed his drawings between themselves in the staff room, saying they were not like the others. There was the art master who told him, half in admiration and half in worry, that he did not seem to see the same world as everyone else, and that this was a gift that might not always feel like one. There were afternoons in the park with friends where Roger would entertain everyone by slipping between characters, imitating classmates, dons, local shopkeepers, not just their voices, but their tics, their anxieties, their particular ways of lying to themselves. That kind of mimicry requires an almost painful alertness to other people. It also demands a self that can be bent and blurred on command. He gave his own mind a nickname long before journalists did. "I've got a very irregular head," he said once, somewhere between a joke and a warning. To people who heard it at the time, it sounded like a charming bit of self-deprecation from someone who could afford to make fun of his own difference. In hindsight, it reads like a plain statement of fact. Another line, offered in some brief and now much-quoted interview, lands with the same doubled edge. "I think young people should have a lot of fun, but I never seem to have any." It is an almost perfect Syd Barrett sentence, apparently simple, faintly whimsical, and quietly devastating if you sit with it for more than a moment. The gap between what should happen and what actually does yawns under the light phrasing. Those close to him talk about how quickly fun turned to strain in his presence during the crucial London years. At the beginning of a night, he would be charming, mischievous, funny in a way that made everyone feel sharper just for being near him. As the hours passed and the chemicals took hold, the energy twisted. Jokes became jagged, observations turned into monologues nobody could follow. His gaze, which had once made people feel intensely seen, began to make them feel like objects in a landscape only he could fully perceive. Friends felt an unease they could not yet name, because the language for psychosis and breakdown was thin on the ground in their world, and because none of them wanted to be the first to say that something had moved beyond eccentric into frightening. On stage at the UFO Club, the distinction was even harder to draw. Imagine one of those nights in detail. The room is thick with smoke and the residue of spilt beer, bodies packed close enough that sweat transfers between strangers without comment. The light show is already its own organism, amoebas of color sliding over the curved ceiling. Pink Floyd begin with a recognizable riff and then peel it apart, stretching notes into long, shimmering threads. People in the audience, dosed to varying degrees, feel as if they can see the sound. Sid stands at the center in his paisley shirt, curls a halo, eyes reflecting not just the lights but something else. Halfway through the set, he stops playing for several bars, staring at the amps as if he can hear a frequency nobody else can. Some in the crowd think it is the bravest thing they have ever seen, a refusal to be a jukebox. Others feel their stomachs clench without knowing why. The band soldiers on. Afterwards, in recollection, it will not be clear where the line lay between a deliberate act of anti-showmanship and a moment in which the performer could not find himself. In the middle of all this, he still turned out pop songs that, stripped of context, sound almost straightforward. See Emily Play is bright, catchy, over in 2.5 minutes, with enough odd images sprinkled in to keep it from sitting comfortably next to more conventional hits of the day. Record executives heard the single, saw the screaming girls at shows and smelled money. They pushed for more. Tour schedules thickened. Television appearances were booked. The amount of time between one demand and the next shrank. For a nervous system already straining under artificial stimulation and unprocessed grief, that acceleration was deadly. Yet to the machinery around him, the fact that things were happening faster was proof that they were going well. It is tempting, looking back, to ask why nobody stepped in. Why no one, a manager, a doctor, a relative, a fellow musician, slammed on the brakes. Part of the answer lies in the historical moment. In late 1960s Britain, comprehensive, compassionate models of mental health care were thin on the ground, even for people with ordinary jobs, let alone for those who had just stumbled into the center of a cultural revolution. The few psychiatrists the music business did call upon tended to be older men with little patience for young artists they assumed were merely indulging themselves. Another part of the answer is less flattering. There were too many people invested in keeping the show going financially and emotionally to hear the alarm bells clearly. When somebody's breakdown is also the engine of your aesthetic, it becomes very hard to tell the difference between the two. There is a cruel symmetry between Syd's early experiments in bending perception for an audience and the way his own perceptions later bent beyond his control. In the beginning, he had played with language and sound, inviting people into little pockets of unreality he could still exit at will. As the years went on, those pockets deepened into sinkholes. Accounts from friends and family mention him becoming convinced that televisions were spying on him, that people were talking about him through objects, that time looped in ways others could not see. Whether you file those experiences under schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, LSD-induced psychosis, or any other diagnostic label, the lived reality for him and those around him was the same: fear, confusion, and a shrinking of the world into tight defensive routines. His family's response was not perfect, but it was, in its own way, steady. His mother's house became a place of refuge rather than a prison. She did not parade him in front of cameras or sell stories to the tabloids. His sister has spoken about how the family negotiated the gap between the public myth and the private man as best they could, fielding letters from fans and journalists while doing the very ordinary work of encouraging him to take his medication, to see a doctor, to get up and go outside when he could. There were tensions and failures and sharp words, as in any household coping with a long-term illness, but there was also a basic, stubborn commitment. He was not a symbol to them. He was Roger, and he was theirs. From time to time, rock history likes to rediscover him. A new documentary is made, a previously unseen photograph surfaces, an anniversary of Piper or Wish You Were Here prompts a spate of think pieces. Invariably, certain images get pulled to the front. The young Syd in striped trousers leaning against a wall, eyes full of humor and challenge. The older Syd, heavier, bald, caught off guard by a telephoto lens while carrying groceries. The contrast is dramatic and easy to consume, the subtext rarely questioned. Brilliance versus ruin, beauty versus decay. What you see much less of is the middle-aged man sanding down a door in his house, or laughing with a neighbor's child, or sitting quietly in a waiting room for a medical appointment. Those moments exist in the memories of people who knew him, but they do not circulate, because they complicate the clean narrative arc. He left behind more than songs and myths. Other musicians who barely knew him or never met him at all cite him as a formative influence. David Bowie covered See Emily Play and spoke of Syd as a key to understanding how Englishness could be made strange on record. Mark Bolan drew on his blend of whimsy and menace. Brian Eno and others in the art rock and ambient worlds have acknowledged how freeing it was to hear someone treat the studio as a place where accidents and glitches were not errors to be fixed, but events to be worked with. In that sense, Syd's irregular head reshaped more minds than just his own. The irony is that the innovative choices he made before his illness fully took hold are often retrospectively conflated with the symptoms that followed, as if mental disintegration were the source of all that creativity rather than a tragic consequence. The debate over what exactly happened to him neurologically is unlikely ever to be settled in a way that satisfies everybody. Some point to the pattern of his withdrawal and oddness even before heavy drug use and argue that LSD merely accelerated a condition that would have surfaced anyway. Others emphasize the sheer quantity and intensity of his trips during a critical developmental window, and frame his story as a dire warning about what certain substances can do to unprotected brains. There is an uncomfortable truth beneath both positions, regardless of the proportions of nature and nurture, chemistry and context. He did not receive the kind of sustained, expert, trauma-informed care that might have made more of his life livable. Instead, he got whatever ad hoc mix of concern, avoidance, romanticization, and profit the people around him could muster. If his story feels particularly haunting now, it may be because the mechanisms that broke him have been scaled up rather than dismantled. The speed at which artists can go from unknown to overexposed has only increased in the age of streaming and social media. The tolerance for eccentricity as long as it sells, and the lack of patience for the messy, expensive work of supporting someone through a breakdown, remain more or less constant. The audience's role has expanded. We no longer just buy albums and tickets. We comment, share, meme, speculate in real time about the state of performers' minds, rewarding vulnerability when it is packaged attractively and recoiling when it spills over in ways that are harder to aestheticize. The user manual for consuming and discarding irregular minds has had a digital chapter added, but its core instructions have not changed much since the late 1960s. Against that backdrop, Syd Barrett's life can be read as both warning and invitation. Warning because it shows how easily a sensitive, eccentric person can be crushed between their own tendencies and a culture that treats those tendencies as raw material. Invitation because it suggests that there might be other ways to relate to such minds, ways that prioritize slowness over velocity, relationship over spectacle, care over content. It asks something not just of bands and managers and labels, but of listeners. We are the ones who decide which stories get rewarded, which images we click on, which myths we repeat without thinking. There is a small, almost throwaway line from him that surfaces in various biographies. I suppose I'm only a person who likes to live freely. Coming from anyone else, it might sound like boilerplate rock and roll cliché. Coming from Syd, it lands differently. Freedom in his case was not about limousines or groupies or limitless budgets. It was about the ability to move through the world without being overwhelmed by other people's expectations, to let his thoughts wander without being dragged back on stage when they frayed. He never really got that kind of freedom once the machine around Pink Floyd started up. What he got instead was a version of freedom defined by other people. The freedom to push further, trip harder, act stranger, as long as the tickets sold and the narrative stayed interesting. When he finally stepped away and chose the narrow freedoms of a small house, a garden, a bicycle, some paint, many observers treated it as a kind of defeat. The crazy diamond had stopped shining. The star had become a recluse. And yet, for all the sadness of his withdrawal, there is also a muted kind of victory in it. He refused to continue playing the role history had written for him. He declined interviews, turned down reunion offers, ignored attempts to pull him back into the spotlight even when they were framed as tributes. In doing so, he asserted a boundary that the culture around him rarely grants its icons: the right to become once again a private person rather than a shared symbol. Perhaps the most honest way to think about Syd Barrett is to hold two images in your head at once. In one, he is on stage at the UFO Club, guitar feeding back, eyes blazing, dragging an audience into unfamiliar territory with the force of his imagination. In the other, he is standing in a supermarket aisle decades later, comparing prices on tins, hair cropped close, body thickened, moving so carefully that you can almost hear him counting his breaths. Between those two scenes lies a whole topography of light and dark, brilliance and damage, care and abandonment. Any version of his story that erases one in favor of the other is not a myth, it is a distortion. When we put the records on now, the needle drops into more than just vinyl. It falls into that entire landscape. Arnold Lane, See Emily Play, Bike, Wish You Were Here, Shine on You Crazy Diamond. They are not just songs but artifacts of a relationship between a mind and a moment, between one person's fragility and a culture's hunger for spectacle. If we listen closely, we can hear faintly underneath the melodies and the echo the sound of questions that were never properly asked at the time. Are you all right? Do you want to stop? What would safety look like for you? Who do you want to be when the lights go down? Those questions come too late for Syd Barrett himself. They do not come too late for the people currently walking the same thin line between creative intensity and collapse. Every era produces its own irregular heads, its own candidates for mythologized breakdown. The least we can do, having watched how one such story unfolded, is to refuse to pretend we do not know how the manual works. And the next time we find ourselves mouthing along to the line, "Shine on, you crazy diamond," feeling the familiar rush of sadness and beauty, we might pause for a heartbeat and ask who exactly we are inviting to shine, and at what cost.